Hello everyone, today we talk about the Pontificate of Innocent III. I remember a very old video I made on the same topic. It's going to be a bit different, a bit more comprehensive. I regret not having made more videos about the history of papacy, specifically, not much, just, history of the church. And while I do see that, generally speaking, people are not interested as much as at least the other topics to these more ecclesiastical stuff, I consider this exactly the reason why it's important to talk about it more. So the video is going to be probably very, very long, or at least, there's going to be a lot into it. So I will not digress on the reasons why this is the case. That would be, let's say, food for maybe another episode, because it's, in my opinion, important to identify the bias, of course, that exists in historical interpretation, in any historical perspective, of course, but also properly the individual mechanisms, like not imputing this to some kind of abstract force that makes deep people abstractly think, but why individuals most of the times have these attitudes. And it's obvious that the most banal thing could be I like more knights clashing and sieges and trebuchets and all this stuff, but let's say we have, as Clausewitzians, we have seen the dimension that moral forces intended in a broader civilizational sense have on historical events. They're fundamentally the most important ones, at least in relative terms, and often also in actually more. And the history of the papacy, especially for whoever studies medieval history, is a must. Like, you really can't do anywhere if you think you can separate any kind of historical understanding from the major spiritual, philosophical, scientific dimension of their times, right? I know that there is much, in fact, of this selection, but it's mostly reflective of a lack of understanding, because if there is no comprehensive view, not of marginal things, but the things that literally made the world move at the time, and with Innocent III, as we will see, that's pretty much the case. Well, chances are that there's really no consistency in any kind of of historical understanding in that. Innocent III is historically relevant, if anything, because under him, and also thanks to him, because he really made a difference as an individual, aside from the pre-Crusade system, the Roman Papacy achieved the acme of its power, right? And we'll look at how fundamentally the whole Western Christendom was virtually under Papal vassalage, or at least recognized and for submission. Innocent gave a new impulse to the bureaucratic character orientation of the Roman Papacy, and managed to enforce, also thanks to the secular support, but through spiritual guidance, some of the most crucial and events and turning points in 13th century history. In a moment where it seemed that the situation was still pretty unstable, because the tumultuous growth of the continent was at this point to be regulated, and some of the most vicious threats to the order of the system were on the form, were almost taking over, as a matter of fact. So Innocent was the tip of the balance in many of these issues, but also was able to channel and to address, let's say, an astonishing amount of the European resources towards very, very effective, positive goals, and also to essentially confer to the Roman Church a solidity and a capacity of of control and projection and administration and probably authority that was unprecedented historically, and that on the longer run in relative terms would decline, albeit the papacy at this point had come to be structured in a way that at least would always would increase, right, would keep on expanding, especially during the 13th century itself and so on. And he's a very fascinating figure also personally. I don't know how much today we'll have the time to explain that, because it's a big story and history, and so probably, and of course we will make other videos about Innocent III, his pontificate, and broadly speaking also about all those events that were connected to it, if not properly caused by it. So the choice of the pontiffs in the course of the 12th century had fallen essentially on figures of politicians and jurists whose program aimed at strengthening the results of the Gregorian reforms, right? And this was carried out through the foundation of a solid primacy of the Roman See on the other episcopal ones of the West, thus the prevalence of the papacy on the Christian kingdoms, and the government of the clergy on the laymen. This was a hierarchic and bureaucratic view that thus aimed at the government of the clergy over society practically, and it had of course it had necessitated to be held by an orderly juridical code. And as we have seen in other videos, which we addressed this enormous achievement, but it was undertaken a systematic work of reorganization of the canons, that is properly the laws and the norms of the church that up to that point had been disorderly, or at least episodically emanated by the pontiffs and the councils. That not found in fact a uniform systematization because of the plurality, of course, of the various churches, let's say, in autonomies, right? And their ambitions. But up to a certain point, the papacy had not been able to control. The age of conciliarism largely was over. So, much of the conciliar sources, for example, belong to a time where, yes, there was a kind of a more universalistic direction guided by Constantinople, but still fundamentally, when the bishops came back to their sees after these encounters, they would kind of develop, they would record what was said there in very personal ways, let's say, on the base of the political convenience that existed locally. And so the same Roman Church in the creation of its monarchy had been contested. There had been some competitors as well, right? And so it doesn't matter what was the primacy of charity, right, of the Roman See that made it effectively the most important since its own foundation over any other. But there was properly also an important work that the Roman Church had done since the beginnings, right, in relation still with the Roman emperors, but also especially after the fall of the West, with this incredible coordination and control capacity that it had in the evangelization, for example, of the same Europe, properly in the expansion of the same church, of its control. And so these are all things maybe we'll see even better, even though we talked about them already in other videos. And however, by the 12th century, as we've seen in other videos, properly on the Decretum, was, this document was created. It was known, in fact, as the Decretum Gratiani, more famous, let's say, from this Camaldolese monk Gratian, that is called actually the Concordia Discordantium Canonum. So the title is quite eloquent because it's about the concord of the discording canons, right? So the aim there is quite meaningful. As we've seen recently when talking about the Gregorian reforms, the spread of some hermetic instances and, important necessities of, spiritual reformation, like the ones expressed, in fact, by the Camaldolese congregation, right, or the Cistercian order, let's say. There was still, in parallel, a great civilizational work of properly, of juridical nature, like in this case, and all what came by it, like all this knowledge was properly acquired in heavily literate contexts with a great deal of, in fact, juridical regulation needs, let's say, for the increasing political, magnitude of the actions, of the increase also of the traffics, economically speaking. So, in other words, also the same creation of the papal monarchy needed this kind of capacity, and Rome had always been, throughout the centuries, the great cultural center of Western Europe, which all the models of effective literacy and administration and properly cultural competence, and also artistical one, and broadly speaking, much else had poured in the rest of Europe from this northwards, let's say, and informing also the emergence of the various in the structuration of the feudal monarchies, of what was starting to regulate itself with some administration and bureaucracy and necessity of such important civil culture. And in the Decretum Gratiani, as we've seen, had become since then the base of the ecclesiastical legislation, right? And aside that, one of the foundations of modern law, right? Which had, also was mirrored at the same time with the revival of the Justinian Code, at least its integration in the previous, let's say, in the medieval legal systems that had developed in the meanwhile, in order to fill the gaps that the juridical science hadn't been able, right, to hadn't needed to address it up to that point, because communities had been relatively simpler, and so with the new problems, people were not much in search of an absolute per se to substitute it to the pre-existing customs and laws. Rather, they were searching for new models that could, let's say, help reorganizing this, great Western, legacy into a more, in fact, theoretical and orderly and systematic way. And so this, of course, reflected the ambitions of the universal powers, right? The canon law, the papal one, and the Roman law, the imperial one. That, of course, had very deep interconnections, as you know. Most of those who began even to, the civilistic branch were fundamentally former episcopal personnel that were, albeit laymen in some cases, some were heavily informed by ecclesiastical administration and were clergymen themselves, and the same clergy was studying Roman law. In fact, the same Innocent III. There are some doubts, but say aside from studying in Rome and Paris, he's thought to have had his education also in Bologna at the time, so in the center of Roman law, fundamentally of civilistics, and this was unavoidable, considering also the investiture controversy and all, and the deep interconnection of secular and clerical society. You must know your enemy in a sense, if you want. But of course, there was a dramatic cooperation in the meanwhile at the same time. Let's say the international situation at the time of the rise of Innocent III was quite dramatic, right? In 1198, at the death of Pope Celestine III, it seems that Europe had remained suddenly without a guide, because the great protagonists of the 12th century, Frederick Barbarossa, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, Henry II of England, the Emperor Manuel Comnenus, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, Henry VI of Hohenstaufen, had all passed, right? And even the lands that were in another subject to the Roman Church were in turmoil. We've seen what was the nature of the Papal States. We'll have to come back on it same time. So on that occasion, the Cardinal College wanted to choose a young pope, right? Who was only 37 years old, but who was already famous for his energy and culture. This was Lothar, of the noble Latial family of the Counts of Segni, south of Rome. He was expert in canonic law, just for truthfully, for many of the popes that had existed in that century, but also of a deeply mystical spirit, and author of a treatise known as the De Miseria Humanae Conditionis, which means of the misery of human condition, in which to the misery of man was counterposed salvation that could come from the above. Lothar had actually written this work that eventually was elected pope, and he wouldn't write the counterpart of it that had to focus instead properly on salvation. So we have the work is very interesting because it kind of shows a bit the mind of the man. It was somewhat had of course in that, as you can imagine, in that work, a dark idea of humanity, of rigged by sin and so on. But there was always the confidence. We see it in his other many works that was obviously corrected always by Christ, by salvation, and so quite of a character here that, as we've seen, was when he was elected by the Cardinal College, he was the youngest of the college himself, and as we've seen, he had come from an aristocratic family, because the Counts of Segni were not really comital title holders. These were essentially a local aristocratic family that was living on on the church lands, and this kind of relation. He had received a very good education in Rome, in Paris. He had studied theology with some of the best teachers of the time. In fact, this left an important mark on him. Right, he was very intellectually and almost proper juridically oriented. He, as we'll see, would carry out actually a Roman policy. Most of his appointees in the ecclesiastical hierarchy were Romans, or Italians at least, and the few, but still, not irrelevant foreigners were often, we're talking about mostly from Western Europe, French, Englishmen, so on, were most of the times all very high-profile intellectual figures that had studied even in there, mostly in Paris, theology, canon law, and so on. So they were experts in the church rites, and in reinforcing fundamentally what the Gregorian reform idea of a papacy that, as we'll see now, will basically has to provide the indication and the guidance and even properly the obedience from which the same secular power is derived and has to obey to. And the man was seemingly of extraordinary intelligence and very open-minded. He was, as we will see now, he found himself with some of the most thorny controversies and problems and issues of the early 13th century, and he was always able to understand the issues quickly and providing with an adequate papal, answer on those, and working relentlessly. Albeit, he also was at some point he was also ill. He was so that he couldn't really break his back all the time, but he always also lamented that his duties, in a temporal sense, would kind of distract him from the important spiritual side. His meditation, his closer experience with God, right? But he was, as we will see now, a person who took also dramatically important decisions on a political, even on a military level, and really managed to reinforce Christendom in a way that, by in absolute scale, at that point, hardly anybody could have done. Right? You can argue that, of course, there were more important popes, given the consequences that their pontificates eventually brought on the long run. But let's say the achievements of Innocent III here are the achievements of a papacy of the 13th century at the acme of itself and of the same medieval civilization that had to cope with issues of unprecedented scale and quite threatening ones, and to which, in fact, Innocent was able to provide with striking and successful solutions. And it's maybe mysticism the true key to understand how necessary in that moment the rise of Luther to Peter's throne, to the Holy See, with the name of Innocent III was, right? Because in this pope, the mystical afflatus, let's say, was turned into a tendency that was already, not withdrawing from the world, but dominating it, right? There is something dramatically positive, right, and energetic and offensive in this. The idea is that, of course, the Pope was persuaded deeply that the Spirit had to rule over the flesh, right? Properly, that the moral dimension has a superiority on matter on a larger scale, and that the papacy represented on earth exactly that spiritual power that had the task of controlling all the other powers, right? Innocent expressed this very clearly, right? He was the one who, I think, if not brought about for the first time, but at least, surely rendered famous and kind of emblematic, that the metaphor of the sun and the moon, where practically the church was the sun and the moon was the empire, so that reflected just what that shone just of the light reflected from the church that was given to him by the church, and this attitude made of Innocent III in fact the direct heir of the great popes that had succeeded from the Reformation on, or with the Reformations, Gregory VII, Alexander III. Whose deeper ideal had been the hierocracy, properly the hegemony of the clergy on society. This is extremely important, right? Because there was no real balance in this, right, on a theoretical level. We know that the struggle, the investiture controversy at this point had ended, like at least in its theoretical sense. The papacy and empire had settled the matter on, essentially sharing the ecclesiastical appointments in Italy and Germany respectively. They had come to some kind of stall in also properly in international policy, in the capacity of also the empire taking over the Italian peninsula, bringing the papacy under direct control, like it had been ideally at the time of the Ottonians. And this was a moment in which consistently universal powers were at the peak, right? The empires we'll see now were starting already to have more severe problems, and so the same adoption of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen by Innocent III is to be understood in this broader vision. So the power of the church itself after the death of Celestine III was to be still considered. Like, what we often don't picture in historically speaking is how precarious all these powers factually were, right? We say, okay, well, there was an empire, there was a papacy, right? There was a France, there was an England, there was a Poland, there was a Byzantine Empire, all these things. And the question is, though, we appreciate, of course, the continuity, which is a miracle, civilizationally speaking, of these entities. But let's say at the same time, we don't understand with how much difficulty these things were kept together and going, right? And how easily things could have differently gone, right? And in Innocent III's time, see that. That's when the Byzantine Empire was essentially destroyed, and where also other powers were crushed. Think about the Muslims at Las Navas, or the same, at least how order was brought, and France expanded under the Albigensian Crusade, but that took a while. But let's say there was something that had gone dramatically close also to another very different direction. The same crusade of the Germans in 1197 with Henry VI, that was about essentially to conquer Constantinople. Instead, he died before the thing, and so could happen. So history really could have taken very different directions, and the papacy was kind of still a bit in between. The main problem were, of course, the Swabians, and the fact that, as you know, with the marriage of Henry VI with Constance d'Hauteville and the birth of Frederick II, the main nightmare of the papacy is to say properly an empire and Sicily together could crush Rome in between, right? Given that they had been reunited dynastically, but was extremely threatening and concerning, and so that went in parallel with all the the universalistic ambitions of the same church, but also the same empire. So the thing revolved around this very big stakes, let's say, and so affirming properly in this context that the church had literally to rule secular authority, it was always there, was not to be erased, because the church, first of all, didn't have really the power to extend, as one of the major European monarchies or anything. But it had this dramatic spiritual profile that was a bit what arguably the world European identity, if it existed at such a time, embodied itself essentially in a Christian sense. And we're talking, in fact, mostly also about Western Christendom in case of Roman Catholicism. But it had broader ambitions, as we will see. Was a very radical statement, because in a sense it's very fascinating. The idea is that, of course, secular authority has to exist, but if it fails morally, it has to be, it has to change, right? Who is at the top, who is unfit, has to be removed. And this concept of the prevalence of the spirit over the matter is objectively also, from a civilizational sense, as we've seen, quite relevant, right? We cannot describe a world where spirit and matter do not interfere with each other. That would be, in fact, a dualistic heresy, like the one that under Innocent III was wiped out in blood in the same southern front. But let's say spirit moves and does things and does conceive things, and yes, it does need matter to substantiate it in flesh, in action, in translating that into reality. But reality, let's say, matter alone doesn't actually do anything, right? It can't do things, but they are random, right? They're just natural phenomena, and therefore there is a, in the spirit, properly, the responsibility of humanity, of ethics, of civilization, all what brings to the idea that, what are we going to do about this experience? And so, as vicar of Christ on earth, the papacy felt that those moral standards fundamentally laid within the same church and within its same head in the vest of fact of Peter's successor, and so this was reflected in the not just in Innocent's policy, but let's say in this acme of papal power that was able to, from this standpoint, still to regulate and to catalyze and to order some of the most important changes in early 13th century history, for eventually things to go on also in a specific way. That was overall, in fact, the peak of medieval civilization throughout the century and so on. And so when we have seen also last month mostly 14th century history, we know what at the contraction of this, how that universalistic power both from the papacy and the empire began to collapse the nation's race. It was this process of secularization, and so in a way that's also how modernity began, relatively at least to this moral and scientific attitude towards reality. In any case, what makes Innocent III's pontificate more striking is the multitude of the political problems that required a solution. A non-banal one is the same reorganization of the lands of the church, right? Because the church had to substantiate still in a government, in a curia, in something that had to work with matter, with income, right? So, and actually under Innocent, it was a very effective administration that wasn't at all, let's say, the parasitic, banal, stereotype that we think of, it could be normally, this terribly obscurantistic papal power at the time, but actually was something that was heading ever more towards the advancement of bureaucracy, which developed further in further generations. It was at the peak. In fact, Western standards at that point, right, it spread further also in countries like France, whatever, in fact, grew ever more close to the papal milieu, and the cooperation there is, with France was under Innocent III. Frankly, France was still, first of all, to properly enter in the game of also Mediterranean policy, because they had to yet conquer Occitania. Surely they were allies, but there were also some diplomatic issues. For example, the rejection of Ingeborg of Denmark by Philip II. All these issues that eventually were taken. That's maybe the only moment where Innocent had to bite the brake a little bit, manifesting also at that moment that the power of France was already reaching. But let's say that's yet another thing. But the organization of Peter's patrimony in central Italy was really an important matter for this properly subsistence needs, and it was worsened by the issues with the empire, because the renewed Swabian power at that point was essentially threatening papal control on some areas that had historically remained always kind of borderline, where the emperor said that this is our land and the pope said this is not, this is ours. And so all those issues that had started since the time of Charlemagne fundamentally had not been resolved, mostly in these areas in central, like parts of the Mark of Tuscany, the Matildic inheritance, some areas had been the former lands of the Exarchate and so on. And in fact, even very close to Rome sometimes, like for example, the city of Viterbo, that was one of the most important papal possessions, was very difficult to hold. Innocent the Third made a made a show off of power there, etc. But at the time of the struggle with Otto of Brunswick, the city passed again against the Pope. So were really heavy issues close to, relatively to Rome. Rome at this point, Innocent made an important effort to affirm its power in the city, He knew it pretty well. First of all, he had worked in tribunals there, and ecclesiastical ones, of course. He also add a tower to the old St. Peter's Basilica. He tried essentially to affirm the papal lordship further in this important city that, after all, in the previous century had expelled the papacy in its communal phase. And in fact, there is something that Innocent III reinforced among the broader struggle against heresy, against figures like Arnold of Brescia or Amalric of Bena, that had been in this Italo-French context kind of quite dangerous figures of heterodox, if not properly of heresy, and had made leverage on the same secular ambitions of the city of Rome against the papal lordship. Crucial, naturally, in the imperial dimension was the renewed papal relation with the communes of central and northern Italy. At this time, let's say, there wasn't much of an escalation aimed at subtracting what was called at the time the Regnum Italia, the Italic kingdom, from the suggestion of a too strong relation with Germany. And this was crucial because, albeit there wasn't at this specific point any military escalation like at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, and how it would happen again under Frederick II later on, still the Lombard League was a very important interlocutor with the papacy, as it had always been, also properly in the vest of an ally during the struggle against the emperor, to keep those areas fundamentally independent from imperial control. That would have still required a large-scale engagement that the same Italians would have, in fact, as events proved, were able to counter, but that probably would have not succeeded even without the support of the papacy in that sense. And the same another important goal was the same solution, let's say, to those questions that had remained open in the same Germany, where the death of Henry VI and the various succession issues. We made a video about Philip of Swabia, Otto of Brunswick, were already manifesting that break that would essentially occur of the German national monarchy and the German princes, that including the same ecclesiastical ones, the great electors of the Rhine, that were starting. They had historically been traditionally pro-emperor, starting essentially to escape centrifugally and to create kind of lordships on their own that could also, in fact, interplay with at that point with the German election in a more autonomistic direction for themselves, and the same issue of southern Italy at the death of Henry VI, because at that point, Sicily was thrown in turmoil once again, and that fundamentally the Haute-Ville had decided to. There were many options actually, but they were all towards a foreign succession, right? Because the main objective of these sovereigns had been fundamentally to stem the baronial competition. So they hated their own vassals, right? And so they would have disrupted much of the tremendous effort that the Norman tradition had made to keep things kind of unitarily and uniformly together, also administratively speaking. So they had thought about the English, that after all had their Norman ancestry, but they had finally opted for the marriage of Henry VI at that time. And I remember where he was already co-emperor with his father, but let's say eventually, he was still the heir of the Holy Roman Empire, and the last heir is Constance. And so the the death of Henry VI. Henry VI had made a war in southern Italy, as we've seen. So the papacy was, because in order to take it over against the barons, so the papacy had, just let the things happen, because the Kingdom of Sicily was effectively a real papal vassal, right? So whatever happened there required a very important supervision from the side of Rome, because it was just a powerful kingdom and just next door. So and now that Henry VI had suddenly died and his son was a minor, well, this meant, of course, the Far West happening, and so very dangerous situation for the same papal possessions, that in part included even, some properly southern lands, such as Benevent, for example, that historically from the time of the Norman conquest had preferred to hand itself over to papacy to the new conquerors. But we're talking mainly also about central Italy proper, and Rome itself by a certain degree. For the papacy, unavoidably, the other great goal was to organize a new crusade, and therefore this was, from one side, would have enhanced the papal control on the same, and so the possibility of increasing its power and directing all these forces of Christendom also against not just foreign but also domestic enemies, and to properly vent all these turbulent forces within the same Christendom to expand the same, and so orienting them where it wouldn't damage the Christendom itself, right? So, which at the end of the day, this is one of the great overlooked aims of the papacy, right? The papacy had a dramatic impact in the actual pacification of Europe, right? It's war between Christians broke out in within Western Christendom. The papacy was obviously always interested, also, practical, materially speaking, let's say, in intervening in the situation, also because it was the obvious ultimate authority in spiritual matters. But there is an absolutely distinct and evident, effort to properly put an end to wars, to specific. So when people say, "Oh, what about the Albigensian Crusade?" Well, that was kind of, it was not just a random thing that we're doing, all the time, right? And even in there, we should understand why that was done, because, frankly, there was more than just a Christian infight in that situation, and the popes actually, the Saint Innocent III in this case, struggled for solving the matter peacefully initially, and so it's just when the thing degenerated that they recurred to arms. And in any case, it's not even that the Pope had a direct control on those arms, as also the Fourth Crusade itself proved, by the way, in its outcome. And there was also, and still, and obviously, in fact, a need of self-regulation of the Church, because at the time there was definitely a resurgence of mundane temptations in a high clergy that was too rich, powerful, and superb, which incidentally was that in this kind of lax moral context had triggered in certain areas also the same spread of heresies, right? Southern France, for example, wasn't particularly under the papal control because of its political fragmentation, because its great wealth, so that these also the local clergy started to do whatever kind of they wanted, kind of in part triggering the Cathar heresy as such, as an anti-materialistic thing. And we have seen recently the extremes of what that reached, actually, not just in that direction, but also somewhat, in fact, bonding with the same heretic cause by saying, okay, let's exploit this in an autonomistic sense from the Church of Rome that still was imitated administratively, and also because there was a lot of contact, as we've seen in the videos about medieval law, between these areas of, in fact, of central northern Italy and southern France that were very similar in many ways, albeit not excessively either, but let's say that had shared this idea of political fragmentation and great wealth, for which the situation was fluidly evolving in a way, and given that Occitania was at least very relatively peripheral to the great powers at the time, whereas at least the Italian communes were compressed between the same Germany and the papacy, etc. There was also a different balance properly in power and the between the clergy and the feudal power and the communal powers in Occitania, which favored in this kind of further let's say instability, we would say. And so this area was had already been far before Innocent III's crusade an area of interest for the papacy, because especially an area of warring because of the spread of heresies that were already present since for quite a while. And so the greater problem was always kind of relaunching the figure of ecclesiastical hierarchies, right? Because many people that had remained kind of disappointed by the Gregorian reforms, or at least still criticized the, as we've seen, this kind of excessive wealth and mundane lifestyle and temporal interests, had remained deluded and disaffected. So this, as a pressure, already reflects the obvious concern for the church to search for a further, regulation, reformation, etc. So it's not definitely just the papacy didn't care, didn't do anything, right? Just that this means not knowing anything effectively about what popes did during the Middle Ages, if you think like that. In any case, the territories of the church were brought soon again papal authority, in spite of the rebellious attitude of some cities, especially in the marches on the Adriatic Sea, were kind of more difficult to control, but Innocent worked pretty well in that direction. Also, he encouraged the creation of leagues in central and northern Italy that could ensure an eventual resistance to new imperial projects similar to the ones that had been proper of Barbarossa. So this meant also, having a say in the political matters of the Italian communes, and having always kind of a papal faction and representatives on the spot, and therefore also the church was everywhere in the first place, but still extending a more direct control on the appointments, because Innocent III was extremely authoritarian in terms of what the freedom of the same clergy was about. Like the papacy in that sense could intervene in any question, in any procedural mechanism of election, of appointment, whichever controversy was occurring within the same church. So this interventism was aimed naturally at having an ever more direct control on peripheral matters in areas that were of great interest, such in fact the ones of the Italian communes. But the big political question of the papacy was that its lands, that as we've seen were situated in the center of the Italian peninsula, could not be crushed by a unique power that would install north and south of the Seine. So in this sense, arguably the most important of the secular matters at this point was at least initially, was guiding the papal policy in the problems of succession to the crowns of Sicily and of Germany. That naturally required two different approaches, because they really worked in very different ways. Sicily, as we've seen, had this more unitary kind of concentrated monarchic power. Germany was at this point was already an elective system, and it was giving the first signs of further disgregation from a monarchic direction. And also in terms of reach, right? The papacy was naturally much more political as far as Germany was concerned because of geographic distance, and whereas for Sicily, kind of it could even intervene militarily in there. But the Pope didn't have just political questions to settle, right? Some great worries kind of troubled his sleep. Let's say, that Christianity could be split into different obediences. That is, the Latin and the Greek one. So, in other words, he was aiming at recomposing the Great Schism and factually of Latinizing the Greek Church. And that, of course, first and foremost, in absolute terms, that Jerusalem could be reconquered by the Muslims. It was just 1187 when the city had fallen, right? So that was a big blow, morally speaking, for Christians. It was seen as a pretty severe issue. All the crusading efforts of those years were, in fact, directed of of this resurging of Christian capacity. The same Islamic powers in Spain had gained steam recently, and so there even seemed to be properly an Islamic comeback in Mediterranean of some sort. It was a precarious situation. We've seen it in that video, the very short introduction also to the Iberian Peninsula that starts from this point and shows kind of, it's about the 13th century, that shows, how serious actually even there the effort, of course, that Las Navas was not just a military victory, but primarily a political one that happened because of Papal coordination that was behind all the great Christian military movements and alliances and funding and all these things. So things do not happen just by chance. You have to really make a gigantic effort to make them work, and that's what the papacy was working relentlessly for. And yet a big deal was also probably the largest one in ecclesiological term, that too many heresies were circulating in Europe, right? And that the church at that point had been incapable of coping with them adequately. As we've seen, this was a pretty dark situation, not just for the papacy, but for Christendom entire, because too many things were unsettled, as we've seen. But the heresies, as we've seen many times in the videos, we may also created a playlist recently about it. By the 12th century, and still at the beginning of the 13th now, we're risking literally to break the unity of Western Christendom. Right? The church was, Europe was blossoming in this sense, but many of the forces also were hypertrophically unregulated, and the heresies were at this point kind of riding the discontent of the new towards the new establishment. Also, these broader failures were occurring, this rejection of wealth that had began to pour dramatically, like the 13th century is starting to become the one of properly of monetary circulation, and there is a surplus now. The trade shift is dramatically in favor of the West. There is probably another mindset that is creating, and the papacy was quite, in this sense, quite updated to understand what was going on and exploiting the new tools and means to a very good end. But at that point, it seemed literally that heresy could break the unity of Western Christendom, especially in Occitania, that was at that point trying to squish out a renewed French ambition towards itself, and therefore also siding with other powers such as Aragon, that Innocent III managed to drive, to get still the obedience of, just like Hungary, Norway, other countries that were formerly in this sense brought within papal control, but different outcomes. In the case, the Crusade conquest of Tsar surely didn't in that sense it surely compromised the relations with Hungary. But anyhow, think about even England later on, after in 1213, when John was obliged to recognize vassalage. England at that point, you would be surprised, was actually much more sensitive and kind of appreciative of the English people, of papal authority than even a country like France, right? If you consider how things went eventually historically, you would be surprised. But that's important because the papacy was really felt as a fatherly figure, as a spiritual point of reference that couldn't quite be bypassed. All Europe was about, the pilgrimage to Rome, right? What people were mostly interested in, passing by Rome, because the ultimate place was going to Jerusalem, was actually Rome, right? There are some Icelandic travel accounts that were of Christians were going from Iceland to Jerusalem, and these accounts are very interesting, and they tell you, the various places they crossed in Europe, and even when they arrived finally in Jerusalem, said, yes, Jerusalem, the holy places and all, Christ was here and there, etc. But factually, it would write a little thing. If you read the part about Rome, it's like it doesn't end anymore. It starts saying, wow, the city, it's plenty of all the monuments, the things, the churches, Rome was seen as an enormous deal. People still believe properly was almost, it's wrong to say it like this, but almost still in a world that was at this point fully Christianized, but still surely reminiscent of other ways of perceptions, as if there was a magical power emanating still from the relics, from the churches, from the holy, and Rome in this sense embodied something that for the West was always kind of unavoidably sacred, as it had remained throughout the centuries, and this was the issue, that next to this there was still another reality that was also the Byzantine Empire properly. And so Innocent III wrote repeatedly to the Emperor of Constantinople proposing this reconciliation between Latins and Greeks, according to a plan that had been already taken in consideration back in the day by Manuel Communes, that was very, very, very interested in Western models, from feudalism to even this aspect of a possible church reconciliation. Well, Manuel would invade Italy to literally bring the papacy almost to say, okay, you know what, we could even pass back, to the if there would have not properly been a coming back to orthodoxy, but let's say the idea that still the Byzantine Empire had embodied a power that was profitable, more profitable to side with rather than the German one, right? But the situation here was different, and yet the Byzantine Empire was a bit the Schwerpunkt of it all, because of course Constantinople at that point saw itself as with its archbishopric, with the model for an enormity of other populations that were not particularly like real centers of power on their own, or at least they would have undergone an important crisis. If you think about Russia, that was a consistent power, but as we were just saying yesterday about the Mongol invasion, that would suffer a dramatic blow, and so Orthodoxy would survive, but later on in different ways as a Byzantine legacy still, but with a dramatic decline that had occurred in the same Orthodox Church because of the collapse of the empire. Also, a great part of Orthodox Christianity, or at least Christianity could be more easily reconciled with Constantinople, and that had factually not much to do with Roman Catholicism, as it was proved also by the relations with the Outremer states, with the Catholic ones. Think about, the Armenians of Cilicia, that were often more like an enemy than anything, but that not much because just of a confessional reason. Of course, there were bigger political, strategical implications, but it's still, what Eastern Christianity was really perceived as something different, even by the same Westerners, of course. And so the main obstacle in this direction was constituted by the fact that the Pope didn't have any intention to renounce to the primacy of the Church of Rome, which is what the Byzantines did not intend to accept at all, right? And together with them, lots of other Orthodox Greeks, or at least whoever had been influenced by it, they didn't even conceive what had happened in the West, right? And so, what happened with the Fourth Crusade actually had a negative impact even in this process, because of course, Constantinople was taken over by Catholic by the Crusaders, and so the divide between in the properly the incomprehension between Catholics and Orthodox was widened dramatically in a irreconcilable way. In fact, the Greek Church would have never forgiven to the Latin one the sack of Constantinople in 1204, during which, admirable works, treasures of art and culture were lost. At least a part of them were saved by the Venetians that had kind of a bit more of a cultural, understanding, so we can still see them in the city. But it was a disaster, right, of enormous implication. Like the Crusader sack of Constantinople was really painful to just know about, and how much was lost and destroyed. Like, by the time of the Ottoman conquest, Constantinople was just an empty trunk, right? There wasn't much else to loot. And so, and all the general failure that the Latin Empire was, right? Even in there was nothing deterministic about it. Really, the Latin Empire declined because sometimes of just think about the defeat at Adrianople. Excuse me, drink a little. And so things could have gone in another way strategically and so on. So the myth that everything the Westerners, the Franks, did in the Near East, in Greece, etc., was hopelessly rigged by the fact that were a bunch of undercultured savages who didn't know how to understand other peoples, and because they were too primitives, and Frankish feudalism couldn't be exported. We're just trying to colonize forcibly. It's just like a historical delusion, really. There were surely limits of this kind, but they weren't so dramatic as we think, and really things could have gone easily, by the way, in a different way. In any case, however things went, there is to stress this, that the Fourth Crusade wasn't at all Innocent III's responsibility. There are lots of people out there that have this, and I understand the fascination with Constantinople. How many times we discussed about the whole thing. I still call the Byzantine Empire, even if I perfectly know that it was Roman and all the narrative, etc. But I still call it Byzantine, and it's not a historical mistake. I can assure you that that's what the academia still does all the time, and not because of bigotry or stupidity, but actually because they understand something that objectively the average person just discovers, that there was a Byzantine Empire that was factually still the Roman Empire, is mostly hallucinated, not to kind of understanding this kind of exaltation for discovery, as if other people didn't know anything about that, and especially they knew less about somebody who just learned the thing. But let's say the outcome of the Fourth Crusade has factually not just anything to do with Innocent III, but in general not much with properly, in terms of decisive factors, or at least the main leading or triggering one, with Western greed or evil, or this kind of paranoid attitude that somebody thinks that for which the Crusaders just wanted to take Constantinople. Of course, taking Constantinople was for them a very big score, but the point about that all is that the Crusade was actually born out of the best intentions of Innocent III, who also was practically not even informed about what was going on. He learned of the sack months after, right? And so he wasn't leading the army. These were not papal divisions, right? And still, the actual fact, as you know, is that it was the Byzantines themselves who called on expressly and on purpose the crusading army when they were still in Venice, even before that, because of the exile, there was this struggle within the same Communes that some had been exiled, they were searching for help in the West, and so they literally brought Crusader army under the walls of Constantinople for making a coup and promising, by the way, a reward that wouldn't come. And the city freaked out. They entrenched themselves, they fortified, and so that turned into the siege that we know and all the thing. But if nobody had called anybody, yes, the Crusaders would have surely thought about, like they had always done by passing by Constantinople to take the city, because of the obvious dramatic international strategic political advantage that would represent. But the Fourth Crusade is not, again, a conspiracy of the West or the Papacy against the Byzantines by default. It was something that the Byzantines shared an equal degree of responsibility, and frankly, the same thing that the fact happened somewhat tells us that the situation within was not particularly functional, as you can imagine. But what was actually disturbing in that the Crusaders did was to what happened is that the Crusaders because this crusade was kind of like, because as we were saying before, there was the Sixth Crusade in 1197, where the Swabian king, the emperor died before launching it, and that would have probably targeted Constantinople by itself, or at least would have consistently posed a threat to it. Then this crusade was launched anyway, and the Germans fucked it up along the way, and so another one was called, and so they tried to put together these forces. It was mostly French Crusaders this time, but they gathered in Venice, and they didn't even have the money to pay the Venetians for shipping them to the Holy Land. So the Venetians said, you know what, this is a famous story. I mean, they told, okay, you don't have money to pay, so help us attacking Zara. This was this Dalmatian city. Still is. That was, at that point, the Venetians were contending to the King of Hungary, that was also a crusader, in the same crusade, by the way, so they had the Papal, protection and all these things. And so the Crusaders kind of accepted, and this was an enormous deal because Papal administration completely abhorred this. It didn't contemplate this and would put the same Crusaders under very severe fines and sanctions by the ecclesiastical administration. And that's part also of the reason why they kind of did the thing a bit on their own, because they didn't want properly news or official info to reach Rome, where the papacy would have surely told it, this is against any canonic law. You can't do that. You can't attack. You're a Crusader army. You cannot attack another Christian state, especially even more one that has joined the same crusade. It would have been aborted. The leaders would have been sanctioned some way. It was a big deal, right? And so eventually Innocent III was utterly horrified when he knew of the fall of Constantinople. Initially, actually, because they didn't know what had happened. So the first news arrived actually from the same crusader who said, we are in Constantinople to control that. And the papacy initially said, oh, well, okay, because they didn't know what had actually happened. When after weeks or months, news began to arrive of what the Crusaders had done in the city, the distractions, the despoliations, the massacre, Innocent III then freaked out, because he perfectly knew that the Crusaders in that sense had screwed up everything in terms of possibility of reuniting the two churches, of recomposing the schism, right? So very far from actually being happy of the fact, as it had happened at that point, that a Latin clergy had been installed eventually in the city of Constantinople that had a Roman Catholic patriarch. And at that point, well, of course, those were, there were Western Christians. The thing had already happened. Then the papacy had to say, okay, well, of course, we control those lands now. There must be an ecclesiastical administration. So eventually those positions were recognized. But it was a disaster in terms of papal policy, because it wasn't just a matter that had been, the crusade had escaped fundamentally papal control, but, that this broader international disaster of enormous proportions, probably the symbol of Orthodox Christianity, sacked and eventually substituted ecclesiastically with Latin clergy. But that was like, it's over, right? If we had any chances to come closer to with the Greeks, but we failed that. And surely, as we know, the same way the papacy dealt with the heresies were, tragic in outcome, and Innocent III, in this sense, bears the full responsibility for it. But we also know what factually happened even in here. It wasn't a plain butchery of innocent people who were just daring to think differently from what the Pope said, right? This was a severely sectary and heretically and autonomistic and politically secessionist movement that was threatening to engulf the whole freaking, a great chunk of Europe in this realization that fundamentally the Occitanian elites were escaping, not just were escaping properly Roman Catholicism in favor of an heresy that was pure dualistic, in fact, a dualistic heresy that in part was trying to replicate, a kind of an alter ego of the Roman Church within its own land, including with the Inquisition, with repressive means, and so on. And the papal diplomacy had worked dramatically to solve the matter peacefully, right? And when the papal legate, it was a Cistercian, by the way, so the papacy was at that point using people that would kind of promote the same ideals of poverty, that would write in part the same reformistic instances of the church. As a legate was assassinated in Occitania, that's at that point, I think, triggered the reaction, because the Occitanian authorities were responsive, because they were benefiting from what was happening, right? Not all of them. It was what the Cathars were, as you know, is subject to debate in a political sense, right? We know that Catharism existed, that the sect existed, that this kind of different churches existed, that the secular authorities kind of supported them or coexisted with them or kind of tolerated them or simply, in fact, fueled them to favor this kind of escaping, especially from the French papal axis. Then eventually it turned into, more than being a mystery of who the Cathars were, of course it turned into a war of conquest, right? That was, motivated by at least the fact that this heretical presence was intolerable and dangerous and threatening, and so there was some civilizational principle of order, of discipline, and of real pacification, considering how also violent some of these movements really were, and factually many other heterodox branches, such as even the Valdensians, etc., other reformers and evangelic pauperistic movement, were actually supporting the Roman Papacy in this, because they realized that the fracture that was being created within Christendom was extremely dangerous. And in fact, from the south of France, Rome had received alarming news. It seemed that from the high aristocracy up to the most humble stratum of the population, everybody had been won over by Catharism, right? The city of Albi, in Languedoc, was almost all Cathar, and for this reason, the Cathars were also called as Albigensians because of Albi. And as we were saying before, the assassination of the papal legate, made the Pope lose patience with all the dramatic negotiation effort that had been made. And so Innocent III at that point decided to intervene with what was indeed an unusual provision, right? That is, launching a crusade, right, against the Albigensians, because the crusade up to that point had been used only against properly non-Christians, right, against the Muslims and against the pagan populations of Northern Europe. So there had, it's not that the papacy normally, launched crusades against just, the next Christian foe, right? It depended on, of of course, what was going on. The greatest struggles in this sense were political, mostly with the Hohenstaufen, and with the fact that they had literally moved war with against the same church in a sense, and so that also had and that was also carried out in a broader context of international struggle in Germany. The Albigensian Crusade was kind of much more of a surgical operation that, however, was also quite successful, considering the fact that eventually the heresy was eradicated. Together with that, also any doubt about the obvious realization that there couldn't be like two different separate centers of Christendom within a world that fundamentally it was not even emerging from different traditions or confessions. This was a pure heresy. It is something that was properly against the scriptures, that denied the incarnation of Christ and refused the cross as a symbol of Satan, that put same Satan and the same power of God, and that was bringing to, as we've seen, as the greatest victory of the soul over this matter created by Satan to death, so you would escape that. Sexual intercourse was prohibited because giving birth to a new soul was condemning it, to trap it into this satanic matter. So all the refusal of creation, that it's something hallucinatingly disturbing, right? And so also in this, it's fascinating to see how I think about Saint Francis. I think we never made a video about Saint Francis. It's important here because there's a bit of the legend that he met with Innocent III, who gave him kind of a support for his preaching and so on. And as you know, Francis, albeit was quite borderline, right, in terms of orthodoxy, but was at least recovering a love for properly creation, even in a material sense, thanking God for properly the world was created. And so obviously an anti-dualistic attitude that of course was necessary for a healthy civilization. So the crusade was banned, and let's say the military control of it was entrusted to fief holders of northern France. That at that point the king was quite happy to get rid of, to get himself rid of, as he was carrying on his struggle against the English. Yes, I mean the Plantagenet possessions, and who wasn't happy of the crusade here? I mean, at least he had been called by Innocent to participate, and he just provided kind of a modest element. Just at least he could exploit this other political aspect, getting rid of the most troublesome noblemen to be sent in southern France, at least to expand what to recover some control, at least on behalf of the same king, given that those territories were French legally, but just for centuries had remained out of reach of the Capetians. And these northern French feudatories were actually well happy to sack and conquer those southern lands that were, by the way, the richest in the country, and thus it was it was a brutal thing, right? The crusade of the Albigensians was also longer than foreseen, right? At least Simon de Montfort, that initially led it, was successful, right? It was just his death at the siege of Toulouse eventually that basically made all the efforts in the previous years collapse, and basically the Toulousains recovered all the power they had before. So the thing went on for a longer time. Sure, the country was destroyed in the process, so at the end of the day, that also contributed to putting down this autonomistic tendencies. But the struggle lasted between 1209 and 1244, right? Given the fall of the last heretical stronghold on the Pyrenees, the castle of Montségur. and the Catars had held fortresses in southern France, some really beautiful and still visible in the most impervious areas you can think, and so were ferocious. That war was really something. But there were surely some nuclei of resistance that remained more or less in secret, right, illegally, especially, and not just in southern France, but especially in Lombardy, in Tuscany, right. Catarism had spread. I mean, it was part of this broader dualistic, heresy that had taken over most, together with infiltrating, let's say, in the areas of greater spread of the paparistic evangelic movements in most developed areas in Europe, right, and as we've seen here in central northern Italy, southern France, the Rhine Valley, even some cities in northeastern France. But we can say objectively that after the Albigensian Crusade, Catarism was defeated. Right, seems the last hotbeds were put down by the mid 14th century, but there was no power at that point that could back them or make it revive politically and so on. The cost morally, however, was very elevated because the church had taken on herself the responsibility of massacres and acts of ferocity that were truly astonishing, had been carried out by the Crusaders, so favoring the resentment of entire populations towards it, right? And even about this, first of all, a person like Innocent III wouldn't quite do this for no reason. He had, as you know, a very logical, rational, juridically based, and theologically based, of course, idea of what papal authority was, and as we've seen, this movement had a broader, threatening potential to create a much deeper fracture within the Christendom than is usually credited. It had received support also from foreign powers that were, in this sense, kind of trying to escape a greater papal control, such as Aragon. And so the question was about reaffirming in an undisputed authority in a moment where such example was worthier than ever, given the delicacy of the international situation, right? So the Albigensian Crusade was actually a success, right? And as for the Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, we know historically that the Pope didn't really have a direct control on the Crusaders in Occitania. So he was, we know from sources, that was not even informed of the most ferocious massacres, and that, of course, the French leaders were carrying out, taking matters in their own hands and deciding, independently from papal decision what this thing would have been about. There is always the episode of Béziers, if I'm not wrong, again, with which the papal legate responded when asked what to do with the with the Catholics that had fought alongside the Catars in the city that had resisted against the same Crusaders, and said, kill them all and God will recognize their own, right? So that phrase is often taken out of context because it was normal to kill everybody who resisted normally, and the Catholics were specifically asked to abandon the city, stop aiding the Catars. These people resisted also because it was kind of their own land, whatever, so they had their own reasons. But at that point, this is the point, you're taking a stand against something that is much greater than your own city, right? You're taking a stand against the possibility of having a pacified, unitary, orderly, disciplined Christendom where everybody can find that same liberty in that stability and pacification. Of course, these people wouldn't give up for more material interests, as material could be the interest of the Crusaders in many ways, that would become lords of those lands, or trying this kind of this profit as always. But in that sense, the papal legate answer was kind of very coldly logical and rational, and things like high treason and posing to supporting an heretic and raising arms against constituted authority, universal powers, was not really something. First of all, you were dead, but even if you had been spared, which could happen, still, the fact that we as a civilization have such a record, so that the same, mostly Catholic sources fundamentally would express the same, the obvious, that would document in the first place, just like the sack of Jerusalem. It was the same old story, right? It's not that those Jews or Christians that were siding with the Muslims during the siege against against the Crusader siege were, just people were kidnapped by the Muslims, and the Crusaders, as Zealotic fanatics, exterminated for no reason afterward. These are people that had actively supported, the defense of the city because, again, of their reason, but still, willingly against the Crusaders. So aside from, of course, nobody could show a pass saying, I was not supporting, I was supporting. Of course, there would be indiscriminate massacres also of innocent civilians. There is no doubt about this, that things happened countless times. But as long as, war was carried out in this, also official best with, proper royal papal representatives, it was never like, okay, let's do just something that, because we're just a bunch of sadistic bastards want to exterminate people. Things at that time were taken very seriously, exactly because they already knew that they would have had an echo, would have had a moral resonance of that this thing would have been told as a dramatically ferocious thing. But again, these people decided to fight against us. We offered them mercy, and if they didn't side against the heretics, they're being recognized as such, and that are recognized as such by the Saint, because those were the Catholics that were properly distinct from the Cathars. So it was really clear what was going on there. So say no, they fight against us, they put lives in of other Christians in danger, at risk. Yes, God will recognize their own at that point. And so it's not such a dramatic or obscurantistic thing. It was what was done all over the warfare of the whole Christian Islam, Christianity, Islam, and whatever other pagan reality. It was the same thing, right? That were the regular norms of dealing with the matter. And so they were surely in part different from ours, but not even that much if you really think about that. And so it was, however, a brutal affair. So this was taken as such, especially a war so long that doesn't properly even seem to have a real end. The thing was politically settled formally only with the dynastic inheritance of those lands later on by the Capetian dynasty, the Capetian monarchs, and so it was a long-term process, right? But at least Catharism had been eradicated. So that was yet another big success, in my opinion. Even for this, if not just because of this fact, and Innocent III, however, was already, as we've seen, disappointed by the Constantinopolitan expedition, was also dissatisfied with the Provençal one. He would have not liked things to go that way. And hell, he was right. So again, we know this from actual documents, from actual things, and you would say, well, who knows what this person told? Of course, you can kind of guess that, yes, there was an idea that, that these people had somewhat, if not deserved, but at least they were, of course, making a very precise stand that the papacy had tried to counter with good means, and now, the consequence was kind of even. But for a pope who really believes with a 13th century mindset that this is a broader universal mission, that there is always some scruple that the leader of the church must have as a properly, if anything, in the face of international opinion, to face with this scale of massacres was, of course, something that would disappoint him, because even if he let's assume he had no personally, intimately, no morality at all, politically speaking, it was important to make things right, without that excess. So of course he was discontent because of that, and that speaks the language of civilization, because of course He was not a schizophrenic person who said, was happy bath of blood but just faking. Right, the two things go in parallel, because if you can't conceive the depth of the moral problem, you cannot escape even something like remorse or regret, and especially in that situation, as we've seen. And yet there is another enormous success that, if these ones weren't just enough to explain the power that Innocent III's church could put in motion, really make you reflect on how much what was achieved during his pontificate. Well, we cannot fail to remind of Spain, where in 1212 the Christians won the Muslims at Las Navas de Tolosa, and that, in a sense, kind of gave the impression that the word crusade had not been betrayed, right? Las Navas was the greatest victory of the Reconquista. It was essentially, this moment in which the Christians managed to swarm, to break the Muslim resistance and swarm from, in a few years, basically all over southern, the southern Iberian Peninsula, where the Caliphate had stood with the richest lands by far historically were in the region, the areas of Cordoba, Sevilla. So that is also these important ports on the Atlantic. As you know, that's the moment in which kind of the political geography crystallized a bit, with the Emirate of Granada in the east, right, in the southeast of Spain, and then in the left, in the mountains, right. Whereas in the west you have this enormous, florid, rich lands, river valleys with cities, etc., that were kind of the best what kind of Muslim civilization had been in the area. They were mostly incorporated by Castile, that was the greatest power. It was even here kind of a disorderly process, because many knights coming literally from everywhere, and this is part also of the reason of the victory. And behind this there was the papacy, of course, kind of settled all around in an autonomous way, but fundamentally that was like it's throughout, given the bradypic rhythms of the Reconquista, that was as if a dam had literally opened. The Christian flood had swarmed all over the peninsula, all in one blow. And in fact, up to that point, up to 1492, there would have not been any other significant kind of territorial change in that after this big advance, as also the Iberian Christian powers began to mostly fight against each other, and the Emirate of Granada was mostly on its own. And yet it was a clamorous victory, and tactically and symbolically, also because of the treasure of the Islamic army was seized, was a dramatic symbol of triumph, properly religiously speaking, right? And what all in the Reconquista revolved around, right? Of Christianity over Islam. And what is very important about Las Navas is that was a joint European effort, right? There were lots of foreign knights in Spain, coming from all over Western Europe, mostly France, as usual, and that had been fundamentally brought there by the concerted effort of the Iberian monarchs with the papacy, that had worked a lot in that. So the Christians managed to deploy this incredible manpower in form of heavy cavalry that literally overwhelmed the Muslim army, and so in that sense, this embodies a bit iconically, and I don't want to be too ideological about this, but indeed the success of a model that goes beyond the Saint Reconquista, that goes looking at what these enormous Western forces were pouring out of everywhere, right? And taking over regions that had traditionally not been under Western control for centuries, and even the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in itself is a proof of the feudalization, Frankization, even of the later Byzantine culture, even partly the same Muslims in other areas, happened in this sense under the pontificate of Innocent III, right, by direct or indirect cause, and it is to be really considered. The interesting aspect of this is that the hero of Las Navas was Peter II of Aragon, Count of King of Aragon and Count of Barcelona, that eventually would die in the Battle of Muret the year after. That was famously one of the greatest victories of Simon de Montfort in Occitania during the Albigensian Crusade, because the Aragonese were deeply involved, as you know, with Occitania, and they were against French expansionism in the area, so they had countered the Crusaders, and ended up, Peter of Aragon ended up killed, right, while defending the city of Montpellier, of which he was lord, by the way. And so this was exploited propagandistically to stress the fact that this hero of the Reconquista, that had participated to the greatest victory of Christian Spain, fundamentally had been killed not by the Saracens, but by the ferocity of the French Crusaders, right? So there was all the hypocrisy of the thing laid out, but in more concrete terms, right? What happened was just that, of course, there are different local interests, and that in this broader scale of things, let's say in that sense, Aragon wasn't probably even operating for a much greater, concern of Christendom while supporting the county of Toulouse, right? But rather its own, and that's also how you make civilizations, just by scale, but what is going on in the meanwhile. So indeed, you can see the victory of Las Navas and the Albigensian Crusade as part of the same universal success of Western Christendom, independently from these other aspects. The main shortcoming in this broader perspective was, however, probably the most important one, and that is to say that all these events were kind of almost overshadowing the fact that Jerusalem was remaining in the hands of the Muslims, almost as a sort of perennial situation. And so also this, from the Christian side, this permanent almost this institutionalization of the crusade, waged here and there with so much success, but not being able to recover Jerusalem, was kind of a jarring event. So you can imagine also the torment of the same Innocent III in front of this, these, in fact, international realization. The Pope was worried by the fact that the Church, come out of the reform of the 11th century, had not managed to win back the heart of the Christians, especially the poorest and most humble ones that crowded the cities that were rising, very fast. And it was kind of obvious, because this church was made up of noblemen, of cultivated people, of powerful hierarchs, right? It was a church of princes and of canonists. So not just the average commoner, indeed. But as we also have explained, like, how else do you want to build up a civilization, right? People that do not quite, you need that skilled personnel and that moral and material resources to make things work. So you have to cooperate with the powerful, and you have to co-opt them, you have to integrate them in the system. And there were special tribunals had been organized with wide powers, and depending alternately on the bishops and the Holy See to test and control the orthodoxy of Christians. This was basically the embryo of the Inquisition. It was a special tribunal wanted by the Pope to unmask the heretics that were eventually entrusted to the secular magistracies to be punished in the measure in which in medieval society heresy, that church could strike only with spiritual sanctions, was also considered a crime. But even in this, there hadn't been much of a success, because it was mostly contemporary politics and society was too fragmented to provide a uniformity in the way justice was executed. Of course, everything was kind of also especially cold, right? It wasn't like today any coercive capacity literally to bring every subject, every person under, control of justice, and they were very political tribunals in nature, right? Even though indeed that was still a valid criterion to cope with it, because still the church had never really cared about the, let's say, the heterodoxy of what would the average commoner actually understand about theology, right? They knew a bunch of things, then they probably didn't think about much else, but they wouldn't even care or understand, or they surely wouldn't be able to explain Christianity in a comprehensive form. And so these people were surely quite borderline, even properly in understanding what Christianity was. But the real problem was when such... And nobody, you see, in front of a literate elite, that the masses had never had a shot, right, as a doctrine, right? Why did all these heresies spread by the 12th century, right? What did the popes care about what an average peasant in early medieval Europe thought? Because it didn't pose any threat, right? Just like paganism. Paganism had never posed a threat in front of the church, historically speaking, in the evangelization of Western Europe, because there was nothing that could compare. Christianity as monotheism would have been extremely complex, articulated, based, systematized, scriptural system that requires a dramatic exegetical capacity, literary cultural background, and so on. Paganism was nothing, was a primitive belief revolving around certain kind of lifestyle that was, morals that was, fitting just by default that kind of lifestyle these people led, and it was no capacity nor understanding properly in engaging in any form of that level of contestation, let's say, so that as soon as these peoples were literate, they immediately became Christian, because it was advantageous for themselves to have a more hierarchically orderly society. And so they kind of grew and blossomed and flourished exactly in this time, by the way. So what happened in the 12th century is that there were new forces that had never been seen before, that were literate, that could instruct the people, the masses, right, to make leverage on them, and to be wanting as parallel elites. That's just what the Albigensians had done, to compete with the church itself by creating fundamentally a copy of the church, even properly in the Roman Curia and everything, in all the grades, the hierarchy, even the Inquisition itself. So you understand that that was a threat, and so it couldn't but be political, right? And so the average person wouldn't quite understand why would the church, or why would there be these clashes in the first place, especially if it was a person who was kind of disconnected, at least from most of these movements, and they didn't have any evident kind of interest in partaking in this. But they would probably understand the reasons behind the masses, but they wouldn't, at this point, they would be mostly discouraged by the fact that such fractures existed within Christendom, so to prove that there was some kind of bad, terrifying sin for which this was happening, rather than, the church being afflicted because of these people didn't quite understand what the church could be. It was mostly a way of winning over the masses in a way or another. So it's at this point, as you know, also with the creation of the mendicant orders, we'll talk about on another occasion, and let's say scholastic, and so even the opening to certain ideas that were quite seducing for the same heretical elites. Think about Aristotle had been forbidden because he was spreading heresy, even in the theologian studium of Paris. And so eventually the church manages to incorporate Aristotle because it realizes that, it's a rationally, scientific-based theory that the church that can fit with a broader understanding of the world at higher levels of, of this, religious, of in case of Christianity at a scriptural level that was still a broader vision of the world, like at elevated levels like the Aristotelian one at the same time. And so that direction shows how understanding and intelligent, deeply so, the papacy was in that regard, and the extraordinary tools that it had to make this paradigm shift, remaining orthodox in that sense, and winning over kind of the confidence of the masses, as these heretic movements were basically put down by that point. So this is an incredible civilizational success, and Innocent participated to this because he understood that he had to speak more directly, from one side, to the heart of the people, right, in a language that would be not one of just of universities or tribunals, but in a sense of the same language that the same heretics had been using, right? And for this, in fact, he favored some movements that were emerging at a popular level in order to live according to the gospel. These were the pauperistic evangelic movements that were quite warring for the ecclesiastical hierarchy, because they often were the same ones that ended up into heresy, right? Because they were fundamentally all about, kind of a more individualistic experience, an anti-hierarchical, anti-authority, anti-wealth side. So they were anti-elite in a way or another. So Innocent instead understood, right, that these movements were needed. He changed strategy with some of them, and he accepted them in the ecclesiastical fabric, right? In this moment, in this way, it would have been, among the other things, also easier to control them, right? This is an important civilizational achievement that mirrors in many ways what the church had already done at some point in its existence. We're talking about the great popes of the Middle Ages, where if you pick Gregory the Great, for example, we have seen there also how, as exactly as an expression of the Roman elite, an educated, legally educated, especially, very powerful and also with noble background individual that became, the same Bishop of Rome between the 6th, the 7th century. So a moment where still, in many ways Rome had, even in relative terms, arguably more importance in a sense, at least under certain aspects. He understood that in order to win over the early medieval European populations, there couldn't be still the late antique model of the senators turned into bishops, radically overly cultured people that would disdain even monks because they were just a bunch of ignorance and of savages. No, there had to be a new model that could speak to the new force of Europe that had remained at the point, the countryside, the masses of the peasantry, those who were to be won over, even using a lower register, different vocabulary, that would be at their level, but only a civilization, only that top culture could understand at that point that, in a fatherly sense, that world was not to be depreciated, but to be guided, to be in a pastoral sense, and so that there had to be a language, a meaning, a purpose that had to be closer, in fact, to the heart of the people as Christians, and winning over that simplicity that was so potentially endowed, and that would facilitate, in fact, would make succeed quickly, and the way only the Roman Church could at that point, the evangelization of Europe in such an orderly and coordinated fashion. And so this contemplated the necessity at the time of Innocent to refound completely the strategy of the church, and Innocent started this with the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, one of the most important, fundamental in the lives of the Roman Church, and in it the Church was definitively declared as a superior body to any other secular power, the unique depository of grace, and the only possible mediator between God and man. The Inquisition finally was introduced as an instrument of control, but there was in this sense always an interest, a worry, an effort to fuel properly the education of the faithful by encouraging the popular preaching, legitimizing the existence of the mendicant orders. This was an energetic and bold program, right, at the limits of paradox, right? They were reaching kind of also same kind of a limit here, because from one side they wanted to elevate the church up to make it intangible, compare any criticism, right? From the other side, they were intending to bring it amidst the Christians, to make her live among them. So the council was actually a triumph of Innocent, but also his extreme act, as he died in 1216. But it's fundamental because that council probably set the conditions to settle for good the issue of heresy. There was a lot of work throughout the 13th century still by his successors to fix this, to also to gradually integrate ever more solidly and mediated, controlled fashion, and the same mendicant orders, some of which, at least a part of them, within themselves kind of were more rebellious, less, they still retained that kind of anarchic character that was proper of the most radical, in fact, extremistic instances of the reform in its pauperistic evangelical nature. At the same St. Francis, as we're saying before, was kind of borderline in terms of orthodoxy, but let's say that this system opened properly to an important phase in the history of Christendom, that was the one of the education of the masses. Right? When you speak of the Inquisition, most people don't think that this was actually a positive thing, that most people actually wanted and required, because it comforted their idea that there was an order, there was somebody watching over that, there was a safe way of being a Christian that could be measured just by looking at the points of reference, and that these movements had been, these heterodox movements had been often violent, had been often divisive, had always brought to damage rather than an improvement of any sort. They were often mixed with reasons that had nothing to do with any theological interpretation. They were often also aimed at simply taking out the elites, sacking their treasures, with a very violent character that had intermingled also with this, the spread of mercenary bands in the countrysides, and had this to which not even secular authorities often could put an end or a remedy or to control, right? So the need for a greater, properly supervision, control, and capacity of intervention was naturally done in parallel between the secular and ecclesiastical elites alike, because there wasn't this kind of contrast at the end of the day in principle, and of course they would cooperate, they needed to cooperate, actually provided with the conditions for civilization to grow more orderly, more peacefully, more serenely, and at the same time to actually educate people. Right, we made videos also about the later Middle Ages, how literacy spread mostly by means of Christian education. Right, there was really nothing else out there. Right, aside from still Christian education was the elementary basis of everything. It was properly the approach to scriptures and to the idea, properly the necessity of somebody interpreting them, having an exegesis, explaining these to people that didn't have the means to do it, right? This favored the spread of literacy, of awareness, right, that people had towards their own religion, which was a big deal. We're talking about the 13th century. It was not normal, as we were saying before, to be aware of your own religion from an actually, theological point of view, in a moral and scientific sense. Most people just didn't kind of have an idea of what that was, because up to that point, the elites had been kind of just the elites, and the rest, who cares, right? Instead, now, also the middle classes had an importance, and together with them, there was this sense that, of course, knowledge had to become more universal. We've seen it also in Dante recently, and so this idea that the Christian society had to be firm in itself, in its faith, in its education, that obviously between two opinions, one at least has to be wrong, or at least and always one is better than the other, is the foundation of a healthy, moral, scientific dimension. That the break of Christendom by this incoherent project, that the secular elites of Occitania and the sectary radical movements had kind of tried to put together, but couldn't work by definition, because there was no real glue to it, no real coherence and consistency to it. There wasn't a unitary power that could kind of carry out its own, policy on its own. And even if there had been, it would have been like there would have not been any reason to escape there the major legitimizing force and spiritual force of in Christendom. This is the Roman Papacy. All the kingdoms here were obviously loyal to the Church, independent. Let's pick the Holy Roman Empire, the German emperors. Yes, they had their quarrels with the papacy, but those were strictly political problems, right? They never supported heresy as such, right? And on the contrary, on the longer run, they self-legitimized themselves. I mean, great part of the reasons why they could even quarrel was that they had accepted each other as such, right? Like a couple. And the point here is that no other, no other movement, but not even abroad, in other Christian contexts, not even the Balkans, when these Paulicians, Bogomil heresies had spread, right? They had ever something like, major power saying, okay, now we switch to heresy because that's just it. Even the Reformation was something else, right? It was most evidently something obviously within the same Christendom, not within, Christendom and a dualistic heresy, right? So there is a very concretely identifiable mismatching or open subversion of the moral and scientific dimension of this kind of heretical movements that literally wouldn't bring anywhere. Again, not because it was just some terrible evil force above that controlled everybody and oppressed everybody, because that never existed historically. And the difficulties of Innocent III's pontificate, so the most powerful the Roman Catholic Church, self-evidently present, but there was just the weight, right, the responsibility, the commitment of a world civilization, like it could be Western Christendom at the time, to actually solve this matter and to, at the end of the day, suppress a regurgitation, surely of emanating from oppression, from frustration, from problems that were not solved by putting down those that movement, but that movement would have done nothing but essentially worsening and kind of iconoclastically, destroy all what was kind of working well, and that the Church was also making a huge effort to improve, as the integration of the evangelic papistic movements in the Roman Church, about which I also made a video back in the day, actually shows, right? So the Pontificate of Innocent III is very fascinating. Together, maybe today we concentrate maybe just on certain specific aspects. So as I said at the beginning, it's very complex to make a video that can render justice to all the the complexity of this historical contest. But let's say we will come back on it for sure and see in detail also what these things really meant, because we never again even made we made some ecclesiastical policy videos, but we still have to cover basically the whole thing. We neither even made a video on the for example, on the Albigensian Crusade in detail, for that matter. So there are lots of interesting things to spot, to observe, and I guess that time allowing, hopefully we will get there. For now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.